Okay, so just going to jump into it. Now, the topic of naturalized metaphysics in Nietzsche stands radically underexplored in the literature on Nietzsche, naturalism, and metaphysics alike. And maybe this is for good reason. People sometimes argue that naturalism is incompatible with metaphysics. Metaphysics seems to concern the world outside the domain of the sciences, and naturalism typically holds that the sciences have some sort of epistemic authority over other forms of inquiry. Plus, while it's more or less standard now to read Nietzsche as a naturalist, reading him as a metaphysician is very controversial, and I'd be happy to talk about what that means and so on. But despite these worries, I'm going to sort of introduce Nietzsche's naturalized metaphysics here. So I'm going to begin by talking about what kind of metaphysician he might be, and then I'm going to give two ways in which he naturalizes metaphysics, and hopefully there should be plenty of time for questions. So it might appear that Nietzsche flat out rejects metaphysics. He says that he professes to attack, quote, metaphysical philosophy. He calls himself a, quote, godless anti-metaphysician. But on my view, this doesn't mean that he rejects metaphysics across the board. When he rejects metaphysics, he rejects what I call two-world conception of metaphysics. Two-world conceptions of metaphysics separate out the empirical world, or what he calls the apparent world, from some non-empirical world, what he calls the true world. And this would be two-world conceptions of metaphysics. A separation between the empirical and the non-empirical can be found all over the place. Plato, Kant, Christianity, Schopenhauer, Buddhism, and so on. Now, these kinds of things, the forms, kingdom of heaven, things in themselves, and so on, they are true worlds in Nietzsche's vocabulary. He's using this ironically because they're said to constitute or ultimately ground or render possible or even redeem something about the empirical world. But there's no reason to identify metaphysics in general with the two worldviews that Nietzsche rejects, despite the fact that Nietzsche himself makes this mistake, and despite the fact that Nietzsche's attack on two-world conceptions of metaphysics pick out real positions in the history of philosophy. But I think that assessing whether or not Nietzsche is a metaphysician, it's an issue in the literature, should not turn on whether or not his philosophy satisfies a two-world conception of metaphysics. It should be clear that he can reject that and still be a metaphysician. What kind of metaphysician? A naturalized metaphysician. Now, Nietzsche's naturalism is generally this idea that philosophy has to be continuous with the sciences, where the sciences are concerned with understanding empirical reality. And the rationale for this continuity relation is that knowledge has to be grounded in what we can in principle encounter in experience, where experience means roughly causal contact with the empirical world. Now, there's a few ways that metaphysics might be continuous with the sciences. And I just want to give you what I think are these two ways, and then there are a bunch of other ways to naturalize metaphysics that I'm not going to look at. I'm just going to look at these two ways, and they are methodological continuity and subject matter continuity. So as I see things, for Nietzsche, legitimate methods in metaphysics are continuous with the sciences by drawing from experience and contributing to confirming views in experience. And subject matters in metaphysics should be continuous with the sciences by concerning the world that can be studied in experience. I'm going to use this broad understanding of naturalized metaphysics going forward. So as I see things, that Nietzsche carves out a space for metaphysics and legitimate philosophy outside the domain of the sciences, even though he is a naturalist in some ways. So in the following, I'm going to look at one example of each kind of continuity. First, methodological, then subject matter. That's all I'm going to do. Now, the passages I'm going to look at are very complex. I just want to pick out these very, very specific things. And we can talk about the complexity of the passages if you like, but very specific points. Everything, any passage in Nietzsche is sort of a can of worms if it's really philosophically substantive. Okay, so the first passage is the Gay Science 354. We'll talk about inference to the best explanation. Now, one way to do metaphysical philosophy in a naturalized way, which a lot of commentators have pointed out, is to employ inference to the best explanation when reasoning to metaphysical conclusions. Inference to the best explanation, of course, is roughly picking the hypothesis that best explains the data. Now, the importance of this method for making and defending scientific claims is just well confirmed. And I think that Nietzsche uses inference to the best explanation to come to metaphysical conclusions. Now, consider how this works in the Gay Science 354. Now, Nietzsche famously begins this passage by saying that consciousness is largely superfluous. He says that we can think and feel and will and act all in ways that don't necessarily rise to the level of representational consciousness. And this leads him to ask why consciousness came into existence in the first place. And he picks out three pieces of empirical evidence. to justifiably give you an explanation. One, consciousness, he says, is linguistic. That is, he says it, quote, takes place in words, that is, communication symbols, end quote. Second, languages, of course, enables communication between individuals, groups, and so on. And third, communication is extremely useful for the kinds of creatures we are. Here's Nietzsche, quote, where need and distress have for a long time forced people to communicate, there finally exists a surplus of this power and art of expression. And then he offers what he calls a conjecture that consciousness came into existence because of the need to communicate. Now, the inference to this conclusion is supported by what Nietzsche says is the best empirical evidence, more or less. He uses inference to the best explanation then to derive a claim about the character of reality, that is the nature of the origin of consciousness. Now, is this claim metaphysical? At first glance, it might not. It just might seem to be scientific. He starts the passage by saying that the initial realization of this problem of consciousness, that is the problem that we can largely do without consciousness, was sparked by developments in, quote, physiology and natural history, end quote. But although some commentators think that Nietzsche does not do metaphysics at all in this passage, the discussion quickly turns metaphysical. He says that new developments in this physiology and natural history have yet to grasp, quote, Leibniz's precocious suspicion that, or his, quote, incomparable insight, as he says later, that, quote, consciousness is a mere accident of the power of representation and not its necessary and essential attribute. So there should be no debate that Leibniz's claim is metaphysical, and Nietzsche seems to see it this way too. His praise of Leibniz refers to necessary and essential features of the world, both modal features and essential features. And these are features that are pervasive in Leibniz's metaphysics, and Nietzsche knew that. And Leibniz's metaphysical view that consciousness is a contingent feature of the character of reality is something that undergirds this entire point that he's making in 354. So this proposed solution to the problem of consciousness then seems to be a metaphysical view. He seems to be using inference to the best explanation to provide a naturalized metaphysical understanding of the origin of consciousness. Now, someone like Leiter, as he talked a few days ago, might suggest that in this passage, Nietzsche is just thinking scientifically, not metaphysically, because he's a methodological naturalist, according to Leiter, who appeals to scientific methods to speculate about what might be the case. But it's helpful to point out here that employing scientific methods doesn't need to lead to making scientific inferences. A naturalized conception of metaphysics can help itself to the way science operates. The fact that some method is used in science doesn't mean that it's off limits for metaphysicians. And metaphysicians don't need to be limited to using non-scientific methods that would gut access to many effective methods in philosophy. So one way to do naturalized metaphysics then, which I see Nietzsche doing, is to suggest what might be the case, that is, what's the nature of reality, outside what the sciences tell us, by drawing on empirical evidence and employing scientific methods when trying to understand that evidence. That's the first passage. Now consider an example of subject matter continuity. So that's methodological continuity, subject matter continuity. A subject that Nietzsche addresses, which falls within both the scope of the metaphysics and science, is the nature of force. Here I'm going to focus on the genealogy, essay 1, number 13. In the passage, Nietzsche lays out a key feature of strong individuals. He says that they cannot help but express strength. Here's Nietzsche, quote, to demand of strength that it should not express itself as strength, that it should not be a desire to overcome, a desire to throw down, a desire to become master, a thirst for enemies and resistances and triumphs, is just as absurd to demand as weakness that it should express itself as strength, end quote. And interestingly, he goes on to justify this view by appeal to the nature of force. And this is a little bit longer of a quote, very famous quote, so it's fun to read, so here it is. A quantum of force, he says, is equivalent to a quantum of drive, will, effect. More, it is nothing other than precisely this very driving, willing, affecting, and only owing to the seduction of language and the fundamental errors that are petrified in it, which conceives and misconceives all effects as conditioned by something that causes effects, or by a subject, can it appear otherwise. As if there were a neutral substratum behind the strong man, which was free to express strength or not to do so. But there's no such substratum. There's no being behind doing, affecting, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything. Scientists do no better when they say force moves or force causes and the like. In all its coolness and its freedom from emotion notwithstanding, our entire science still lies under the misleading influence of language and is not disposed of that little changeling, the subject. The atom, for example, is just a changeling, as is the Kantian thing in itself, end quote. Okay. I hope this makes sense. The very famous passage uses the example here is the lightning passage, where he says, why do we say lightning strikes, like subject predicate? Like the lightning is the strike. There's no lightning behind the strike. The doing, the becoming, or the doing is everything. The doer is just sort of put behind. Okay. And so he thinks the subject predicate of our structure of our language sort of gives us a mistaken metaphysics about the world, leads us into errors. So the theme here in this passage is that force is not grounded. That is, there's no non-force substrate that ontologically separates expressions of force from that which enables expressions of force. Sartre later puts this really well at the beginning of Being Nothingness. He writes, force is not a metaphysical conatus of an unknown which lies behind its effects. Sorry? It is the totality of these effects. I have to flip one more page. So force is not something behind its effects. It is the effects. Expressions of force are identical to force, full stop. Nietzsche points out then that thinking otherwise is just a problematic byproduct of the subject-predicate structure of our language. And this linguistic problem stands in the way of coming to an accurate metaphysical picture. Now, there's reason to believe that the justification of Nietzsche's position of force comes from Boscovich. Now, Boscovich was an 18th century mathematician and physicist who argued that we should reconceive the basic level of reality as point centers of attractive and repulsive forces rather than as hard, extended Newtonian atoms. Now, we might think that Boscovich, and maybe then Nietzsche, is just giving us a new physical theory of force. Nothing metaphysical here, just natural science stuff. But things are complicated in this regard. A primary motivation behind Boscovich's challenge to Newton and his subsequent development of a new system of nature is to try to reconcile Newtonian physics, primarily gravitational theory, with Leibnizian metaphysics, specifically the idea of monads as non-material centers of force. Now, it's not clear whether this kind of move is more scientific or metaphysical. Sometimes I say this in a talk, and people will say, Boscovich is, of course, a metaphysician, but it's not always clear. Okay, so what I want to point out here is that just because Nietzsche endorses Boscovich's view of force doesn't mean he's necessarily doing metaphysics. So something else has to be going on if I'm going to say that he's really doing metaphysics. And I think something else is going on. His remarks are remarkably metaphysical. So reconceiving the nature of force enables Boscovich to offer post-Newtonian explanations of phenomena like the cohesion of atoms and bulk materials and certain chemical compositions. But Boscovich's understanding of force is never used to explain the kind of phenomena that Nietzsche is talking about. Nietzsche uses Boscovich to supply a metaphysical basis for his preferred view of agency. He tells us that force is equal to driving, willing, and affecting. And he uses these particular properties to pick out attributes exemplified by types of individuals. These are character types, right? Types of people that live. Now, this kind of macroscopic explanation is something that seems to be very metaphysical. Boscovich never did this, and Nietzsche is now extending it. Now, whether or not he's entitled to these extensions is beside the point. What I just want to say is that, look, Nietzsche is making metaphysical statements that are supposed to illuminate the nature of agency. Now, the idea is then that you have Boscovich giving you a particular maybe scientific explanation of what's going on that then Nietzsche picks up and then applies to certain metaphysical phenomena, the nature of action, agency, types of individuals, and so on, not unlike what we see in the metaphysics of agency right now. So Nietzsche's understanding of the metaphysics of agency, inspired by scientific examinations of force, seems to be another way in which he offers a naturalized metaphysics. Okay, so just a few remarks to end here. I've attempted to sort of introduce Nietzsche's naturalized metaphysics by first giving you a basic understanding of what it might look like when it comes to methodological continuity and subject matter continuity. And then I've tried to give an example of methodological continuity in terms of inference to best explanation, example of subject matter continuity by looking at force, and hopefully this helps us understand better Nietzsche's relation to metaphysics, naturalism, and science. Thank you so much.